March 24, 1945. The sky over Berlin. Engine oil mixed with cordite smoke at 25,000 feet. Black pilots gripped controls, while German voices crackled through radio static, laughing, mocking, promising easy kills. The Luftwaffe had been told these men couldn't fly, couldn't fight, couldn't lead. They called them Schwarze Vogel, black birds, easy prey. Then the red tails dove. How did men trained in the worst conditions, flying hand-me-down aircraft, mocked by their own military, become the most feared escort fighters in the European theater? Follow the path from a segregated airfield in Alabama to the smoking ruins of the Luftwaffe's best squadrons. This wasn't just about flying. It was about proving that courage has no color, that skill destroys prejudice, and that sometimes the men everyone underestimates become the ones no enemy can forget. Before we begin, please subscribe and tap like to support the channel. Watch till the end to see the mission that silenced every critic, and the moment when mockery turned into the highest military honors America could give. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. July 19, 1941, Tuskegee, Alabama. Heat rose from red clay like breath from a furnace. The air smelled of pine sap, aviation fuel, and something else, doubt, thick as the humidity. At Tuskegee Army Air Field, a different kind of war was beginning, not in the skies over Europe, but on American soil, where the enemy wore the same uniform. The men who arrived carried duffel bags and dreams that weighed more than luggage. They had heard the whispers, read the editorials, felt the stares. Negroes lack the intelligence, interest, and reflexes to fly, a War Department report had stated in 1940. That was on paper. In person, the message was simpler: you don't belong here. The airfield itself told that story. While white cadets trained at modern facilities with new aircraft and experienced instructors, Tuskegee got the leftovers. The runways were shorter, the barracks older, the equipment worn. PT-17 Stearman biplanes sat in rows, their fabric wings patched, engines coughing blue smoke on startup. These were training aircraft that other bases had retired. Then came ground school, navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, engine mechanics. The classrooms smelled of chalk dust and old wood. Maps covered the walls. An instructor pointed to cloud formations, explaining how to read weather at altitude, how to navigate by stars when instruments failed, how to calculate fuel consumption down to the last gallon. You will know your aircraft better than you know yourself, the instructor said. When you're at 20,000 feet and your engine starts missing, you won't have time to check a manual. You'll have seconds to decide, bail out or fix it in the air. The cadets scribbled notes on whatever paper they could find. The military provided minimal supplies. Some wrote on the backs of old forms. Others shared notebooks, passing them back and forth like precious cargo. Numbers told part of the story. In 1941, the Army Air Corps had exactly 0 black pilots. The entire American military was segregated. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate bathrooms. In some southern towns near military bases, black soldiers in uniform were still expected to step off sidewalks when white civilians passed. Yet here at Tuskegee, these men were being trained to fly machines that cost $50,000 each, to navigate at speeds over 300 miles per hour, to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. The contradiction was absurd and obvious to everyone. The first flights came after weeks of ground preparation. Walking out to the flight line felt like stepping onto holy ground. The PT-17 Stearman sat waiting, its radial engine ticking as it cooled in the morning air. The smell was intoxicating. High-octane fuel, engine oil, doped fabric, and possibility. A cadet named Robert Tresville climbed into the rear cockpit for his first lesson. His instructor, a white lieutenant named James Fuller, settled into the front seat. Fuller had been at Tuskegee for 2 months and had already washed out 6 cadets. His voice came through the Gosport tube, the speaking system that connected the 2 cockpits. "Hands on the controls. Feel what I'm doing." The engine roared to life. The propeller became a blur. The aircraft shuddered, eager. They taxied to the runway, the tailwheel bumping over uneven ground. Then Fuller pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration pressed Tresville back into his seat. The wings bit into the air. The ground fell away. For the first time, he saw the world as birds see it, vast, open, and suddenly making sense in a way it never had before. "Your aircraft," Fuller said through the tube. Tresville's hands closed on the stick. The PT-17 responded to the smallest movement, dipping left when he breathed wrong, climbing when he tensed. It was like learning to dance with a partner who knew every mistake before you made it. "Relax," Fuller said. "The airplane wants to fly. You're just along to give it direction." They flew for 30 minutes. When they landed, Tresville's hands shook. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and he couldn't stop smiling. He had touched something real, something the doubters said he could never reach. But not everyone made it. The washout rate was brutal. Cadets who couldn't master spins were gone. Those who froze during emergency procedures were sent packing. Some failed written exams. Others couldn't handle the physical demands. By the end of the first class, more than half had been eliminated. The ones who remained grew closer than brothers. They studied together late into the night, quizzing each other on aircraft systems and navigation calculations. They shared food packages from home. When one man struggled with aerobatics, 3 others would stay after hours to walk him through the maneuvers on the ground, hands tracing paths through the air, until it clicked. "We knew we weren't just flying for ourselves," said a cadet named Lemuel Custis. "Every time we went up, we carried every black person in America with us. We couldn't afford to fail." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The town of Tuskegee itself was a study in contradictions. The Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, was a beacon of black education and excellence. But step outside its gates, and the Old South waited, with its rules and its rage. Signs pointed to colored waiting rooms and water fountains. Restaurants refused service. The local movie theater made black patrons sit in the balcony. The cadets in flight training were officers, or would be soon. They wore uniforms representing the United States military. Yet in town, they were still subject to Jim Crow laws that treated them as less than human. One Saturday evening, 3 cadets in uniform walked into a diner. The waitress looked at them, looked at the door, then at her manager. The manager shook his head. "We don't serve your kind," he said. One of the cadets, a man named Clarence Jameson, who would later fly 89 combat missions, spoke quietly. "We serve your kind. We're training to defend this country." "Not in my restaurant," the manager said. They left without causing a scene, but the anger stayed, sharp and clean. It became fuel. Every insult was another reason to excel, another reason to prove the doubters catastrophically wrong. Back at the airfield, training intensified. The cadets moved from basic trainers to the BT-13 Valiant, a heavier, faster aircraft nicknamed the Vultee-vibrator for the way it shook at high speeds. Then came the AT-6 Texan, the advanced trainer that handled more like a fighter, quick, responsive, and unforgiving of mistakes. Formation flying began. 3 aircraft, wingtip to wingtip, maintaining position through turns and climbs. It required total concentration, eyes constantly moving from instruments to horizon to the other aircraft just feet away. A moment's distraction could mean a mid-air collision. Gunnery training followed. They flew to ranges and fired at targets towed behind other aircraft or at ground targets marked with white cloth. The .30 caliber machine guns hammered, the smell of cordite filled the cockpit, and spent brass casings rattled around their feet. "You're not just learning to fly," an instructor told them. "You're learning to fly and fight and navigate and communicate all at the same time while someone's trying to kill you. If you can't do all of that automatically, you're dead." The first class graduated on March 7, 1942. 5 men received their silver wings: Benjamin Davis Jr., George Roberts, Charles DeBow, Lemuel Custis, and Mac Ross. Photographs were taken. Handshakes were firm. The moment felt historic because it was. These were the first black military pilots in American history. The ceremony was small. No newsreel cameras, no national press, just families, instructors, and the quiet knowledge that something impossible had just become real. Captain Mitchell, the instructor who had promised they would fail, shook Davis's hand. His grip was strong, his eyes different than they had been 9 months earlier. "I was wrong," Mitchell said simply. "Fly safe." But graduation was just the beginning. Now came the question no one had answered. What would the military do with black fighter pilots? Would they see combat? Would they be relegated to support roles? Would they be allowed to prove themselves in the only place that mattered, against the enemy? The answer came slowly, reluctantly, and only after more pressure from outside the military. The Tuskegee Airmen, as they would soon be called, were about to enter a war that didn't want them. They would fly missions their own country doubted they could complete, and they would face an enemy who had been told these men were inferior in every way. The Luftwaffe was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating people. April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first all-black combat unit in the Air Corps, shipped out to North Africa. They sailed from New York Harbor on the transport that smelled of diesel, salt water, and the nervous sweat of men heading to war. The ship was crowded, bunks stacked 3 high, the air below deck thick and stale. They arrived in Casablanca, Morocco, and then moved to bases in Tunisia, where the desert stretched endlessly and the heat made metal too hot to touch. The landscape was all sand, scrub brush, and flies. Tents flapped in the wind. Dust got into everything: food, water, engines, lungs. Their aircraft were P-40 Warhawks, shark-mouthed fighters that were already obsolete by 1943 standards, while other squadrons were transitioning to P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The 99th got the hand-me-downs. The P-40s were tough and reliable, but slower and less maneuverable than what the Luftwaffe was flying. "We got the planes nobody else wanted," a pilot named Elwood Driver said, "so we flew them better than anyone else could." The ground crews worked miracles. They scavenged parts from wrecked aircraft, machined replacements from scrap metal, and kept engines running on grit and ingenuity. A crew chief named William Campbell could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, standing 20 feet away while the mechanics ran it up. "That's a fouled plug in cylinder 3, he'd say. And he'd be right. The 99th flew their first combat mission on June 2, 1943, a dive bombing attack on the German-held island of Pantelleria. 12 P-40s loaded with 500-pound bombs took off in the pre-dawn darkness. The island appeared below, rocky and brown, ringed with anti-aircraft batteries. Lieutenant Charles Hall rolled into his dive. The ground rushed up. Flak burst around his aircraft, black puffs that smelled like sulfur and death. He released at 3,000 feet, pulled hard on the stick, and felt the G-forces press him into his seat as the P-40 climbed away. Behind him, the bombs hit, explosions that threw dirt and debris into the air. All 12 aircraft returned safely. It was a successful mission by any measure, but back at base the whispers continued. Some white officers questioned whether the black pilots had actually hit their targets. Others suggested they had been lucky. The scrutiny was constant, exhausting, and unfair. "We had to be perfect," Hall said later. "Anything less would be used as proof that we didn't belong." 2 weeks later, Hall got his chance to prove it beyond any doubt. On July 2, 1943, he was flying Escort for B-25 bombers over Sicily when German fighters appeared. Focke-Wulf FW-190s, fast and deadly, painted in gray-green camouflage with black crosses on their wings. Hall's radio crackled. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high." He looked up and saw them diving. His hands moved automatically, throttle forward, stick back, eyes tracking the lead FW-190 as it came down toward the bombers. The German pilot was good, his approach angle perfect, his speed building. Hall pulled his P-40 into a climbing turn, cutting off the Germans' attack. The two fighters met head-on, both firing. Tracer rounds streaked through the air like angry fireflies. The sound was enormous, his own guns hammering, the engine roaring, the slipstream screaming past the canopy. The German broke left. Hall followed, pulling hard, feeling the edges of his vision gray from the G-forces. The P-40 shuddered, on the edge of a stall, but stayed with the FW-190 through the turn. Now Hall was behind him. He centered the Pipper, the gun sight reticle, on the German's fuselage and pressed the trigger. The 6 .50 caliber machine guns roared. Shells walked up the German's wing, across the cockpit, into the engine. Smoke poured out. Pieces flew off. The FW-190 rolled inverted and went down trailing fire. Charles Hall had just scored the first aerial victory for the Tuskegee Airmen. When he landed, his crew chief counted the bullet holes in his own aircraft, 7. Hall climbed down from the cockpit, legs shaking from adrenaline, and was mobbed by his squadron mates. They pounded his back, shouted his name, and for a moment, the weight of representing an entire people lifted just a little. But the skepticism didn't vanish with one victory. In September 1943, a report was submitted to the War Department questioning the performance of the 99th Fighter Squadron. It suggested that black pilots were inferior in combat and should be relegated to support roles. The report was based on selective data and outright prejudice. It ignored the successful missions, the difficult conditions, and the obsolete aircraft. It was designed to confirm what certain officers had believed from the beginning. The Tuskegee Airmen's commander, Benjamin Davis, Jr., now a lieutenant colonel, traveled to Washington to testify before a committee. He brought mission reports, kill confirmations, and the testimony of bomber crews who had flown with his men. "My pilots have flown over 200 combat missions," Davis said, his voice steady despite the rage he felt. "They have escorted bombers deep into enemy territory and brought them home safely. They have engaged the Luftwaffe and won. If that is not the definition of success, then I do not know what is." The committee listened. The report was quietly buried. The 99th Fighter Squadron would continue flying combat missions. But the real vindication was still to come. The Tuskegee Airmen were about to join the fight in the skies over Europe, where the stakes were higher, the missions longer, and the enemy more experienced. They would trade their P-40 Warhawks for P-51 Mustangs, the best fighter aircraft in the world, and they would paint those Mustangs' tails bright red so that every bomber crew and every German pilot would know exactly who was coming. The red tails were about to become a legend. January 1944. Ramatelli Airfield, Italy. The Adriatic wind cut across the runway, carrying the smell of sea salt and aircraft exhaust. Snow dusted the Apennine Mountains in the distance. The 332nd Fighter Group had arrived. 3 full squadrons of Tuskegee Airmen, nearly 100 pilots, ready to join the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. They were no longer flying hand-me-down P-40s. Lined up on the hard stand were rows of P-47 Thunderbolts, massive fighters with radio engines that sounded like rolling thunder. Each aircraft weighed 7 tons fully loaded, carried 8.50 caliber machine guns, and could absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring its pilot home. But something else was about to change, something visible from miles away. The maintenance crews were painting the tails of every aircraft in the group bright red, a vivid, unmistakable crimson that stood out against gray winter skies and the drab colors of war. "Make them bright," Colonel Davis ordered. "I want every bomber crew in the 15th Air Force to know who's protecting them." The choice was tactical and symbolic. In the chaos of aerial combat, where dozens of aircraft twisted and turned at high speed, bomber crews needed to identify their escorts instantly. The red tails would become a signature, a promise, and eventually, a legend. Master Sergeant William Holloman supervised the paint job. He and his crew worked through cold nights, brushes and spray guns applying coat after coat until the red gleamed even in weak winter sunlight. "Luftwaffe's gonna see us coming from 20 miles out," one mechanic joked. "Good," Holloman replied. "Let 'em see what's coming for them." The strategic situation in early 1944 was brutal. American bomber formations, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators were flying deep into Germany to destroy oil refineries, aircraft factories, and rail yards. These missions covered hundreds of miles over enemy territory. Without fighter escort, the bombers were being slaughtered. German flak and fighters had shot down hundreds of heavy bombers. Entire squadrons disappeared in single missions. Crew losses were staggering. Young men who had never seen their 21st birthday, incinerated in altitude or frozen to death in shattered aircraft falling through thin air. The bomber crews were desperate for reliable escort fighters that would stay with them all the way to the target and back. Previous escort tactics had fighters sweeping ahead, hunting for enemy aircraft, but often leaving the bombers unprotected during the critical moments over the target. Davis gathered his pilots for the mission briefing that would define their role. The ready room smelled of coffee, leather, and nervous anticipation. Maps covered the walls. Red strings stretched from Ramitelli across the Adriatic, over the Alps, deep into the heart of Germany. "Gentlemen," Davis began, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured to reach this moment. "Our mission is simple, but not easy. We will escort the heavy bombers to their targets and bring them home. We will not leave them to chase after enemy fighters. We will not abandon them for personal glory. We stay with the bombers, always." A pilot named Edward Gleed raised his hand. "Sir, if a German fighter breaks through and we can intercept." "You intercept and you return to the formation," Davis said. "The bombers are our responsibility. Every single one of them has 10 men aboard, 10 lives depending on us to do our job." It was a radical doctrine. Other fighter groups chased kills and glory. The Red Tails would fly a different mission: protection over personal achievement, bomber survival over individual victory counts. It would cost them opportunities for A status, but it would earn them something more valuable: absolute trust. The first major mission came on January 27, 1944. The target was a German communications center near Anzio, where Allied forces had just landed and were fighting for survival. 64 P-47s took off in the pre-dawn darkness, their red tails reflecting the runway lights like embers lifted by wind. Lieutenant Robert D. Ives flew as wingman in a four-ship Element. As his Thunderbolt climbed through 10,000 feet, the sun broke over the horizon, painting the underside of clouds gold and pink. Below, the Adriatic stretched out dark blue and endless. Ahead, somewhere in the distance, bombers were assembling into their massive formations. The rendezvous point was over the coastline. The eyes saw them first, a box formation of 36 B-17s, their aluminum skins gleaming, contrails streaming behind like white ribbons. The bombers looked solid and reassuring until you remembered each one carried 500-pound bombs and 10 scared young men. "Red leader to all flights, take up escort positions," Davis's voice crackled over the radio, calm and measured. "Stay tight, stay alert." The P-47 spread out around the bomber formation, high cover, low cover, rear guard. The eyes settled into position off the right wing of the lead bomber element. Through his canopy, he could see the bomber crew looking out at him. One gunner waved. The eyes rocked his wings in response. They crossed the coast. Below, Italy unrolled in shades of brown and green, scarred with bomb craters and wrecked vehicles. The bomber formation droned forward at 180 miles per hour, agonizingly slow for fighters that could cruise at 350. The red tails throttled back, their big engines rumbling and popping, staying in position. Then the flak started. Black bursts appeared ahead, blossoming like deadly flowers at exact altitude. The German anti-aircraft batteries had them ranged. The bomber formation flew straight through it because that was what bomber formations did. They held course, held altitude, and trusted their armor and their luck. A B-17 off the left side took a direct hit. The explosion was visible through the smoke, an orange flash, then pieces spinning away. Parachutes bloomed. D's counted 5. 5 out of 10. The rest went down with the aircraft. "Hold formation," Davis ordered over the radio. His voice was steady, betraying nothing of what he must have felt watching men die. The P-47s flew through the flak alongside the bombers. Shrapnel pinged off metal. D's heard it hit his aircraft, small impacts that felt like someone throwing gravel. His instruments stayed green. Engine temperature normal. Oil pressure normal. He was still flying. The target appeared ahead, a cluster of buildings and radio towers. The lead bombardier's voice came through on the common frequency. "Bombay doors open. IP in 30 seconds. IP, initial point, the start of the bomb run, where the bombers had to fly absolutely straight and level for 2 agonizing minutes while the bombardier lined up his sight. 2 minutes when they couldn't dodge, couldn't turn, could only fly and pray. That's when the Luftwaffe arrived. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." The call came from a P-47 flying top cover. Mi-109s, 8 of them. D's looked up and saw the German fighters diving out of the sun, their black crosses visible against yellow noses, smoke trails marking their cannon fire. They were diving straight for the bombers, trying to break the formation before the bombs dropped. 4 P-47s from high cover intercepted, meeting the German dive with a climbing attack. Tracer rounds crossed in the thin air. One Mi-109 exploded, a brilliant flash followed by tumbling debris. Another pulled off its attack, trailing smoke. But 3 broke through, boring in on the bomber formation. D shoved his throttle to the firewall and pulled into a hard climbing turn. The G-forces pressed him into his seat. His vision tunneled, gray at the edges. The Thunderbolt groaned, but responded, her massive engine delivering every horsepower. He came up under a Mi-109 that was lining up on a B-17. The German pilot was focused on the bomber, probably never saw the red-tailed P-47 rising behind him. D centered the gun sight and fired. 8.5 caliber machine guns converged their fire. The hammering filled the cockpit, the smell of cordite overwhelming. The Me-109's tail came apart. The German fighter snap-rolled left and fell away, spinning. Dice didn't watch it go down. He was already looking for the next threat, scanning the sky and sectors the way they had trained, always moving, always searching. Bombs away. The bombardier's triumphant call came through the radio. Below, the target disappeared in eruptions of smoke and debris. The bomber formation began its turn away from the target, heading back toward the coast, toward safety. The red tails stayed with them, weaving above and beside, eyes scanning constantly. More German fighters appeared over the next 20 minutes, 2 more waves, trying to hit the bombers during their vulnerable egress. Each time the red tails intercepted, turning into the attacks, forcing the Germans to fight the escorts instead of reaching the bombers. Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester shot down 2 Me-109s in a single engagement, his P-47 snapping from target to target with deadly precision. Captain Lemuel Custis damaged another so badly it broke off trailing fire from both wings. By the time they crossed back over the Adriatic, every bomber that had survived the flak was still flying. Not one had been lost to enemy fighters. The bomber crews knew it. As the formation approached the coast, Dice saw gunners waving from their positions, pointing at the red tails, giving thumbs up. When they landed back at Ramatelli, the ground crews counted bullet holes and cataloged damage. Dice's P-47 had taken 7 hits, none critical. Other aircraft came back with worse, one with half its rudder shot away, another with hydraulic fluid spraying from punctured lines. But every pilot who took off that morning came home. The word spread fast. Bomber crews started requesting the red tails specifically for escort. They had a new saying: "If you see red tails, you're coming home." By March 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group transitioned to P-51 Mustangs, the finest fighter aircraft of the war. The Mustang was everything a pilot could want: fast, maneuverable, with range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With external fuel tanks, a P-51 could fly over 1,600 miles. The ground crews painted the tails bright red, along with red stripes on the wings and nose. Now the red tails were flying the best aircraft available, and they had proven they knew how to use them. The missions grew longer and more dangerous. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Ploesti, the names of heavily defended targets that appeared on briefing maps with increasing frequency. Each mission meant 6 to 8 hours in the cockpit, much of it over enemy territory, where a mechanical failure or a lucky German shot meant either capture or death. On March 24, 1945, the mission that would cement their legend forever appeared on the board. Berlin, the German capital, defended by hundreds of flak batteries and the remaining veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe. It was the longest escort mission of the war, 1,600 miles round trip. The briefing room was silent as the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain, revealing the red string stretching all the way to Berlin. Someone whistled low. Someone else muttered a prayer. "Gentlemen," Colonel Davis said, "this is what we came here to do." 60 P-51s took off before dawn. The Mustangs climbed through broken clouds, their Packard Merlin engines singing at cruise power. The formation assembled over the Adriatic, then turned north toward the Alps. Captain Roscoe Brown led a flight of 4. His wingman was Lieutenant Charles Brantley, a quiet man from Pennsylvania who was flying his 43rd mission. As they crossed the Alps, Brown checked his fuel, his instruments, his wingman's position. Everything by the book. Everything perfect. The bomber stream appeared ahead. Over 200 B-17s and B-24s, a sky full of aluminum and firepower. The red tails moved into position, high and low, ready for what was coming. German fighters rose to meet them 50 miles from Berlin. Not the inexperienced replacements the Luftwaffe had been fielding lately, but something new and terrifying. Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, aircraft that could fly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. Brown saw them first. Two silver jets streaking through the bomber formation, their cannon fire tearing into a B-17 that staggered and fell out of formation trailing smoke. The jets were gone before anyone could react, their speed overwhelming. Jets at 6 o'clock high, coming around for another pass. Brown made a split-second decision. The Me-262s were faster, but they had to slow down to attack effectively. If he could catch one in the turn. He pushed his throttle to maximum emergency power and dove, building speed, trading altitude for velocity. His Mustang screamed downward, the airframe shaking, the engine howling. The airspeed indicator went past the red line, 450 miles an hour, 460, 470. The jet was pulling out of its attack, starting to climb. Brown led the target, anticipating where it would be, and fired. The 6.5 caliber guns in his Mustang's wings erupted. Tracers arced across the sky. The first burst missed. Brown corrected, fired again. This time he saw strikes on the Me-262's fuselage. The jet kept flying. They were tough aircraft, heavily armored. Brown stayed with it, firing in controlled bursts, walking his fire toward the engine nacelles. Suddenly, the left engine exploded. A brilliant flash followed by streaming fire. The Me-262 rolled inverted and went down, trailing black smoke that marked its fall like a funeral banner. Roscoe Brown had just shot down one of the Luftwaffe's most advanced fighters in a piston-engine aircraft that was, on paper, completely outclassed. "Splash one jet," his wingman called over the radio, his voice electric with excitement. The bombers reached Berlin. Below, the city sprawled vast and gray, already heavily damaged from years of bombing. Flak filled the sky, so thick it looked solid, like you could walk on it. The bomber formation plowed through, bomb bay doors opening, bombardiers hunched over their sights. More German fighters appeared, conventional Me-109s and FW-190s, trying to exploit the chaos of the flak barrage. The Red Tails intercepted them all, turning every attack, forcing every German pilot to fight the escorts before they could reach the bombers. Lieutenant Charles Brantley found himself in a turning fight with an FW-190 over eastern Berlin. The German pilot was good, keeping his nose up, trying to get angles for a shot. The two fighters circled each other like hawks, altitude bleeding away with each turn. Brantley waited for his moment. The FW-190 pilot made a small mistake, pulled too hard, his aircraft shuddering on the edge of a stall. Brantley rolled inverted, pulled through, and came out directly behind the German fighter at 200 yards. He fired. The stream of .5 caliber rounds walked up the FW-190's fuselage. The canopy shattered. The aircraft nosed over and dove straight down, trailing pieces. Brantley didn't celebrate. He was already climbing back to altitude, back to the bombers, back to his duty. By the time the bomber formation turned for home, the Red Tails had engaged and defeated every German attack. 3 Me-262 jets had been shot down by the 332nd that day, an unprecedented achievement. Multiple conventional fighters had also been destroyed or damaged. Most importantly, not a single bomber under Red Tail escort was lost to enemy fighters that day. The mission took 8 hours. When they landed back at Ramatelli, the pilots climbed out of their cockpits exhausted, their flight suits soaked with sweat despite the cold, their hands cramped from gripping the controls. Ground crews swarmed over the aircraft, counting bullet holes, checking for damage, refueling and rearming for the next day's mission. That night, a message arrived from the bomber crews. It was simple. "Thank you, Red Tails. You brought us home." Word of the Berlin mission spread through the 15th Air Force like wildfire. Bomber crews who had never flown with the Red Tails started requesting them. Other fighter groups asked how they achieved such protection rates. The answer was always the same: discipline, training, and an absolute commitment to the mission over personal glory. By April 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had flown over 1,500 combat missions. Their kill total was climbing past 100 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air. They had also strafed hundreds of targets on the ground: locomotives, trucks, aircraft on airfields, anything that supported the German war machine. But the statistics that mattered most were these: in over 200 bomber escort missions, the Red Tails never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. No other fighter group in the 15th Air Force could make that claim. The mockery had stopped. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived encounters with the Red Tails warned others: watch for the Red Tails. They are different. They do not leave their bombers. They are dangerous. German radio propaganda tried to dismiss them, but the lies rang hollow. You cannot mock men who consistently defeat you in combat. You cannot call people inferior when they shoot down your best pilots in your most advanced aircraft. On the ground at captured German airfields, intelligence officers found documents, Luftwaffe tactical reports, that specifically mentioned the red-tailed American fighters and recommended avoiding engagements with them when possible. The ultimate compliment from an enemy: fear disguised as tactical caution. May 8, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. The war was over. At Ramitelli Airfield, red-tail pilots gathered around a radio to hear the official announcement. Some cheered. Some sat quietly, thinking about the friends who hadn't made it home. Some cried. They had flown 15,533 sorties and 1,578 missions. They had destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and another 150 on the ground. They had damaged or destroyed hundreds of ground targets. 66 of their own pilots had been killed in action. 32 had been captured and spent months in prisoner of war camps. But they had proven something that no amount of prejudice could deny. Courage, skill, and determination have nothing to do with the color of a man's skin. The journey home began in June. The pilots and ground crews boarded transport ships that smelled of diesel and salt air. They sailed across the Mediterranean, through the Strait of Gibraltar, across the Atlantic to New York Harbor. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning mist, grown men wept. They had left as untested pilots, flying obsolete aircraft, dismissed by their own military. They returned as combat veterans who had defeated the Luftwaffe's best and earned the respect of every man who flew with them. But America in 1945 was still segregated. The same men who had flown P-51 Mustangs over Berlin returned to a country where they couldn't eat in certain restaurants or stay in certain hotels. Military bases remained segregated. The contradiction was painful and obvious. At a debriefing in Washington, Colonel Davis addressed a room full of senior Air Force officers. The room was silent as he presented the 332nd's combat record. Missions flown, bombers protected, enemy aircraft destroyed. Gentlemen, Davis concluded, my pilots have proven beyond any doubt that the color of a man's skin has no bearing on his ability to fly, fight, and lead. We have paid for that proof in blood and honor. I trust the Air Force will remember it. One general in the back of the room stood and began to clap. Slowly others joined until the entire room was applauding. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. The awards came next: Distinguished Unit Citations, Silver Stars, Distinguished Flying Crosses, Purple Hearts. The medals were presented at ceremonies across the country. Families who had worried and prayed saw their sons, husbands, and brothers honored as heroes. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. received the Silver Star for his leadership and courage. In the citation, it noted that his outstanding tactical skill and personal valor had been instrumental in the success of the 332nd Fighter Group. But perhaps the greatest honor came from the bomber crews themselves. In squadron ready rooms across America, photos appeared on bulletin boards. Pictures of P-51 Mustangs with bright red tails flying in formation, silhouetted against clouds. Beneath them, handwritten notes, "Guardian Angels," and "They brought us home." The Tuskegee Airmen returned to civilian life changed men. Some used the GI Bill to attend college, becoming doctors, lawyers, teachers, and engineers. Others remained in the military as the Air Force slowly began to integrate. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the armed forces. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen had made that order possible. Years later, historians would study their record and find it remarkable not just for what they achieved in combat, but for how they changed America itself. They had fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany, another against prejudice at home. They won both. In the 1990s, the Tuskegee Airmen began receiving the recognition that had been too long delayed. President Bill Clinton awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively in 2007. Many of the original pilots, now in their 80s and 90s, attended the ceremony in their dress uniforms, chests covered with medals earned decades earlier. "You were doubted and dismissed," Clinton said at the ceremony. "You proved everyone wrong. You changed this nation. You changed the world." The men who had once been mocked, who had flown hand-me-down aircraft from segregated airfields, who had been told they lacked the intelligence and ability to fly, stood tall as the nation finally acknowledged what bomber crews had known since 1944. The Red Tails were the best. Their legacy extends beyond their combat record. Every African-American pilot who flies today, in the military, in commercial aviation, in any cockpit anywhere, flies in the wake of those red tails. Every barrier broken, every opportunity earned, traces back to men who refused to accept the limits others tried to place on them. The Luftwaffe had mocked them. The mockery ended with over 100 German aircraft shot from the sky and hundreds of bombers brought safely home. What began as doubt and prejudice ended in respect, honor, and a legend that will never fade. The Red Tails flew into history, trailing contrails and glory. They proved that excellence cannot be denied, that courage recognizes no color, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not just against the enemy, but against the ignorance and fear in our own hearts. The sky remembers them. Every time a fighter pilot pushes the throttle forward, every time a bomber crew trusts their escorts, every time someone looks up and sees a contrail against blue sky, the Red Tails are there, a reminder that the impossible is just another mission to be flown. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.